Hi YouTube, Darth here. This is Battle Plan, where I talk about all the big picture strategies you can use to help your team to victory on battlefield maps. Today's map is Operation Outbreak, also known as the Community Operations map. This is one of my favorite Conquest maps and one of the more popular maps in Battlefield 4. It's no surprise that this is one of the most popular maps as it features great combined arms gameplay in a unique jungle setting. If you want armor gameplay, you got it. Infantry gameplay, you've got it in spades. In this video, I'll go over all the tactics, strategies, and tips you can use to help your team to victory. When the DICE LA developers were first talking about the Community Operations map, they wanted a map that was roughly the size of Zavad with similar play. Well, Operation Outbreak is about the size of Zavad, but unlike that map, Outbreak has only 5 flags on Conquest Large. These flags are Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo. On 32-player sized Conquest, this shrinks to just 3 flags with Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. It's rare that I see a server running the small Conquest version on PC, as most servers tend to stick to the larger version. So for today, I'm going to talk about the large version. On Conquest Large, there are some subtle differences in the travel time between flags. The Chinese and US teams enjoy similar access from their spawn to their gimmies, but there are some big differences. The biggest difference is that the distance from Alpha to Bravo is only 224 meters, while the distance between Delta and Echo is 274 meters. This means a roughly 8-second longer travel time between Delta and Echo. This can take even longer as there is more rough terrain between Delta and Echo than Alpha and Bravo. All 4 exterior points are about symmetrically distant from one another, with the Chinese team enjoying slightly easier access to Charlie. Balance-wise, this map comes out in the US team's favor in almost a third more matches than the Chinese team. However, the map ends in extremely close games. This fact is very encouraging for teams that play smartly. Being an open layout Conquest map, nearly every point is up for grabs. So I try to think about this map in terms of points that you can control. For me, an open Conquest large map usually translates into a 3-point defense. This generally works because it involves the least travel time for myself and the most burn time for my team. For the US, it's relatively easy to focus on Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie as they have the 3 shortest distances between them on the map. Locking down these 3 points all game will pretty much guarantee the US team the win. The shorter travel times are probably part of the reason why the US wins more frequently on this map. For the Chinese team, it's somewhat difficult to hold the same triangle on their side of the map. It's about 30 meters longer, which means about 5 more seconds of travel time between points. Additionally, the distance between Charlie and Delta to Echo is quite a bit more rough terrain than Charlie to Bravo or Alpha to Bravo. As the Chinese, you can try running the triangle on this map, but you're going to need good access to transportation for your squad. Each team has points that are critical for it to capture, and a lot of teams get hung up on Charlie, which is not necessarily the most critical point on the map. As the US team, if you can't manage to hold the trifecta of points at Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, I'd highly recommend taking a shot at Echo or Delta. Both of these points are essential to the Chinese team, but Delta might actually be the most important point on the map for the Chinese team. Denying them Delta means drawing most of the resources away from Charlie, especially the respawns. Capturing Delta can put the US team in a pretty advantageous position to pinch Charlie, especially if the US team has Bravo, and Delta is actually a relatively easy point to take as its spawns are extremely predictable, as I'll get to later. Additionally, capturing Delta works pretty well for jumping to Charlie even if the Chinese team has Bravo, as most of the Chinese team is usually in the mountains or at Bravo. So really quick, I want to talk about the rough terrain on either side of Charlie. This area is pretty much a trap for any team. It's difficult to clear and doesn't provide amazing advantages for capturing either Bravo, Charlie, or Delta. But I often see 2 or 3 squads from either team go straight into these areas after Charlie is captured. I called it a trap because these areas slow down the team's ability to capture the other points when there are generally much faster and better routes available. Sticking with the US strategy of backcapping the Chinese team, capturing Echo is quite effective at drawing the Chinese team almost entirely out of the map. The travel times from Echo to any point on the map are extremely severe. The rough terrain I was talking about is generally pretty good at slowing the Chinese down from getting back into the map. There are a couple of ways to counter this aggression on the part of the Chinese team. Firstly, the Chinese team should prioritize holding Delta and concentrate on keeping the pair of points at Delta and Charlie. Echo is good to have, but hard to keep from the US team. If an American team is particularly tenacious about committing a lot of manpower to Echo, there's a chance you can flip the map. If the US team overcommits, Echo's isolation works in favor of the Chinese team too. This is the point at which you should consider striking out at Alpha and Bravo. These 2 points are easier to control together than Delta and Echo. I'd focus first on capturing Alpha, as you'll come up behind respawning defenders at Bravo and generally face less resistance if the US team is committed at Charlie and Echo. However, keep in mind that this requires awareness of the map situation. If the bulk of the US team is free to recapture Alpha, you'll face a lot of resistance coming from Bravo and the US spawn. Beyond that, Operation Outbreak is pretty open to creative interpretation. Map awareness is pretty much going to be your friend, and you'll want to spot where the enemy team is weak and try to take it from them. The travel times can be quite long, so you'll need transportation, and once you get to your target, you'll want a good tactical awareness of the individual capture areas. On that note, let's talk about the individual capture points. First, observe the spawn behavior around the flags. Of all the maps I've reviewed, Operation Outbreak has some of the simplest spawns. Each point has at most 8 spawn locations, and Delta has only 6. Most of these are split evenly between the two teams, except for Alpha, which has 8 shared points. I'll talk more about what this means in each capture point, but be aware that memorizing these locations makes Operation Outbreak one of the most predictable maps in the game. However, Alpha is probably the hardest point to capture by yourself. This is because it's the only point where all the defending respawns surround the point on all sides equally. My advice for capturing Alpha would be to bring a buddy or a recon kit with the tugs or sensors. If you can't do that, then you're going to need to have your head on a swivel, because enemies could literally come from every direction. It gets even hairier as the Chinese, as you'll have to worry about reinforcing US armor. So lay mines too, if you can. One of the best points for infantry combat on Operation Outbreak, Bravo's capture area is pretty well sealed off from vehicle intervention. The spawn points for Bravo break evenly between the east and the west, where the US team is always going to come from the west and the Chinese team from the east. The Chinese team gets screwed pretty hard in this respect, as all of their respawns originate on a single island in the east. Ultimately, if you're looking to capture this point, you'll want to be careful to minimize your exposure. I find that the stairs on the sides of the points, tunnels below, and behind the walls generally work pretty well. Avoiding being directly in the middle is pretty key if you don't have backup, as it's the first place anybody is going to look. This point turns into a cat and mouse game between defenders and attackers. Getting overly aggressive does not work in your favor on Bravo, so exercise caution and be patient. The central point of the map. Pretty much everything is destructible, so get your explosives ready. Again, the spawn points here are split between the western US and eastern Chinese, so you can expect defenders to generally come from those directions. There is a ton of infantry action at this point, and I really would recommend against bringing armor directly into Charlie without a ton of infantry support, as there's very little room for error. As far as the infantry combat goes, you'll want to find cover and stick to it. Generally, there is at least a squad hanging out at Charlie at any given time, and popping your head up turns you into a whack-a-mole pretty quickly. Consider running a silencer at this location, or playing conservatively. Interestingly enough, the spawn points at Delta are some of the easiest to predict in the game. The vast majority of defenders are going to come from the south. There are a few others that will come from the river crossing to the southeast of the flag near the dumpster, but again, this isn't far off from the same vector. Otherwise, it's easy for two teams of infantry to get intermixed at this point. Delta is another capture location where having sensors is exceptionally useful to figure out enemy locations before you accidentally stumble upon them. Finally, Echo is like Alpha in that some spawns can come from any direction. If you're the Chinese team, you'll need to worry about the US team mostly spawning in the north behind the oil storage tanks, and the west along the river, or the one screw you point in the east in the orchard. As the US team, the Chinese defenders will primarily come from the southeast, with some along the river and the rest spawning next to the helipad. There's a lot of cover here from infantry, and some of the stronger positions for the US are elevated in the dumpsters under the lean-to. Personally, I like to hunt defenders from the two warehouses, as there is a good bit of clutter around the warehouses to peek and hide behind. Just about every loadout has something to contribute on Operation Outbreak, but I'll talk about two of my favorites, AT Engineer and Aggressive Recon. First, the AT Engineer. The tank, LAV, and transport helicopter are the three major components of either team. These vehicles can really ruin a team if they are played by competent drivers. However, they're not very effective at capturing Bravo, Charlie, or Delta unassisted. That's why the AT Engineer has a lot of opportunities to help their team out. I like to run with AT mines, a SMAR RPG, and a solid all-rounder carbine like the SG-553, ACWR, or AK-5C. You'll have the power to deal with both infantry and armor. Aggressive recon is exceptionally powerful because of the confined spaces and close quarters action at Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. I typically run with the tugs or sensors, a radio beacon, and a silenced carbine. Again, the SG-553, ACWR, or AK-5C are good choices. As an aggressive recon, you can be an absolute terror at any of these points because of the predictability of spawns and the ability to spot enemies long before they find you. Now I want to talk about the vehicles on Operation Outbreak because they can definitely turn the tide of a game or completely crush a team. Transportation is utterly important for getting around, and having a good transport pilot can be crucial. You'll find that an exceptionally good transport pilot can keep backcaps capped in their favor and really mulch up infantry in an annoying way. If the enemy transport chopper is making itself a nuisance, I highly recommend jumping into a rib boat at either Bravo or Echo and then shredding the transport with your minigun. If it runs away, the rivers cover most of the map, so feel free to chase it down. As an LAV or tank driver, night vision is utterly essential on this map. FLIR seems to be preferred, but IRNV is also plenty effective. If you're in the secondary position, I highly recommend running the incendiary grenade, as there are tons of places you can lob it to get surprise kills. Finally, as an armor driver, your goal should be to support the infantry on the ground. Make the enemy armor a priority target if it gets close, and leave capturing points to the infantry. You are mostly playing support to your team's offensive on this map, as it's too easy to get C4'd inside the center points. Operation Outbreak is easily one of my favorite maps. I think this is one of the best maps for clever teams in the game. Even when the match is unbalanced, it's generally not a total blowout, unlike many of the other maps in the game. It plays fast and is quite a lot of rewarding fun. It's definitely a model of community engagement to help build a better Battlefield map. As for being a clever team, if you can defend your team's critical points, make use of good map awareness about the enemy position, and keep their backcaps in jeopardy, that's the match. Or at least, that's the plan. That's it for this episode of Battle Plan. If you're new around here, please be sure to check out my channel and consider subscribing. In case you're wondering, I do plan to continue this series in Battlefield 1. If you like this video, be sure to force choke that like button. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, YouTube.